On a cold October morning in 2023, the demolition excavator penetrated the parched earth of an abandoned property in rural Millbrook County, Iowa. What should have been just another day of earth-moving work would transform into the most disturbing discovery in the history of the American Midwest. Buried at a depth of 4 meters, completely filled with compacted soil, lay an orange Ford Pinto, and inside it, the mortal remains of a man who had disappeared exactly 52 years earlier. If you appreciate real investigations, cases that challenge logical explanations, and mysteries that remain without a definitive solution, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on the notification bell because in the next 30 minutes, you are going to learn about a story that involves wealth, disappearance, and a discovery that would make the blood of any investigator freeze in their veins. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, we need to go back in time. We need to know the man behind the mystery. We need to understand who Robert James Thornfield was. Born on March 15, 1928 in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Robert grew up with the smell of damp earth impregnated in his clothes and the sound of the wind crossing the cornfields as a constant soundtrack to his childhood. The son of subsistence farmers, Robert learned early on the value of hard work and the land. But unlike his father, who was content with small harvests and modest survival, Robert had ambitions that extended far beyond the flat horizon of Iowa. At 17 years old, Robert stood 1 meter and 82 centimeters tall, with broad shoulders developed by years of manual labor and blue-gray eyes that, according to his younger sister Dorothy, seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked at. His dark brown hair was always impeccably combed back, even on the hottest summer days in the fields. He was a man who understood the importance of appearances. After serving briefly at the end of World War II, Robert returned to Iowa in 1947 with a crystal-clear vision of what he wanted to build. While other veterans sought jobs in growing cities, Robert saw opportunity exactly where he had grown up. Post-war America was hungry, literally, and Robert Thornfield intended to feed it. In 1949, at 21 years old, he bought his first 80 acres of land with a loan that would make his father roll his eyes in disapproval. But Robert was not interested in opinions. He was interested in results, and the results came quickly. Using progressive agricultural techniques that he had obsessively studied in specialized magazines, Robert achieved productivity per acre that left his neighbors perplexed. He was one of the first farmers in the region to adopt chemical fertilizers on a large scale, systematic irrigation, and scientifically planned crop rotation. While other farmers gathered at church on Sundays, Robert was in his makeshift office calculating profit margins and planning expansions. By 1970, Robert Thornfield was at the height of his power. At 42 years old, he controlled one of the largest independent agricultural operations in Iowa. His personal wealth was estimated at more than $3 million, a considerable fortune for the time. He drove a shiny black Cadillac DeVille, wore custom-tailored suits even to inspect fields, and had enough political influence to have direct lines to state senators. But there were cracks in the perfect facade that Robert had so carefully built. Margaret was visibly unhappy. Neighbors commented on how she had lost weight, how her eyes seemed perpetually tired. She began spending long periods at her parents' house in Des Moines, taking Jamie with her. Rumors of an imminent separation circulated in the county's social circles. And there was something more, something that few knew at the time, but that would become crucial to understanding what was to come. Robert Thornfield had made enemies, many enemies. The morning of October 14, 1971, dawned with dense fog over the fields of Thornfield Farms. It was a Thursday. The thermometer read 12 degrees Celsius at 6 in the morning, typical autumn temperature in Iowa, that damp cold that penetrates the bones and makes joints ache. Robert woke up at 5:15, as always.
Margaret had been in Des Moines for 3 weeks, officially visiting her parents, but everyone knew it was an undeclared separation. Jamie, at 11 years old, was with her. The house was silent in a way that went beyond the simple physical absence of people. It was a silence that foreshadowed something. Dorothy called Robert at 6:30. She remembers the exact time because she was preparing breakfast for her own children before they left for school. Bob seemed different that morning, she reported years later. His voice had an urgency she had never heard before. He asked her to come to the farm that afternoon. He said he needed to talk about something important, about the future of the property. When Dorothy asked if everything was okay, Robert hesitated. It was a hesitation so out of character for Robert that made Dorothy grip the phone tighter. "Just come," he finally said, around 3 o'clock. After hanging up with Dorothy, Robert called his lawyer, Charles Peaton, in Cedar Rapids. Peaton's secretary, Ellen Krause, answered the call and noted it in her appointment book, a detail that would become vitally important later. Robert requested an urgent meeting for that afternoon at 5 o'clock. "I need to review some documents," he said, "documents that cannot wait." Peaton found the request strange. Robert was meticulous with planning, never scheduling last-minute meetings, but the lawyer agreed. At 5 o'clock, his office. At 7:40 in the morning, Robert was seen for the last time by a reliable witness. Thomas Henriksen, his foreman for 14 years, crossed Robert on the road leading to the grain storage silos. Henriksen was driving a green John Deere tractor. Robert was in an orange Ford Pinto. And here is where the story gets interesting. Robert Thornfield was known for driving a black Cadillac DeVille. It was his signature vehicle, a symbol of his success. But that morning, for the first time Henriksen could remember, Robert was driving a Ford Pinto, a compact, economical car, completely inconsistent with the image Robert so carefully cultivated. "I thought it was strange," Henriksen told investigators weeks later. "The Pinto looked new. It still had that dealer's shine. But why on earth would Mr. Thornfield be driving that instead of his Cadillac? It was like seeing a king wearing peasant's clothes." The two men stopped their vehicles side by side on the dirt road. Robert lowered the window. Henriksen noticed that his boss looked tired, with deep, dark circles that the morning light cruelly accentuated. But his voice was firm, controlled as always. "Thomas, I need you to oversee the harvest in the northeast sector today," Robert said. "I'll be off the farm this afternoon, personal matters." Henriksen agreed. It was unusual for Robert to be absent during harvest season. He personally oversaw every aspect of the operation, but it was not an employee's place to question. "There is one more thing," Robert added, in a tone that Henriksen would later describe as almost apologetic. "If anyone comes looking for me today, anyone, you didn't see me, do you understand?" Henriksen did not understand, but he agreed again. Robert nodded, put the Pinto in gear, and drove toward the south sector of the property. It was the last time Thomas Henriksen would see Robert Thornfield alive. At 9:15 in the morning, Helen Morrison, who operated the small gas station and grocery store at the entrance of Thornfield Farms, recalled seeing a black Cadillac enter the property at high speed.
Farms saw the orange Pinto pass by at high speed on the main road, heading toward the town of Riverdale, 23 kilometers away. She could not see the driver clearly through the dusty windshield, but assumed it was Robert. Who else would be driving a car leaving Thornfield Farms? But here's the crucial detail. Helen Morrison was not absolutely certain that it was Robert behind the wheel. Between 9:15 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, Robert Thornfield simply vanished. No one saw him. No one spoke to him. He evaporated like the morning fog that had covered his fields that day. At 3 o'clock, Dorothy arrived at the main house of Thornfield Farms, as promised. She parked her blue station wagon in front of the house and waited and waited. 15 minutes. 30 minutes. She rang the doorbell several times, tried the door, it was locked. She walked around the property calling her brother's name. Silence. At 3:45, Dorothy went to the barns looking for Henriksen. The foreman confirmed that Robert had said he would be off the property but should have returned for the meeting with his sister. They checked the garage. Robert's black Cadillac was there, perfectly parked, impeccably clean as always. The orange Ford Pinto was not. At 5:10 in the afternoon, Charles Peston, the lawyer, called Thornfield Farms looking for Robert. He had not shown up for the scheduled meeting. He had not called to cancel or reschedule. For a man obsessed with punctuality and procedures, this was unthinkable. Dorothy felt the first real grip of fear in her stomach. At 6 o'clock in the evening, as the October sun cast long shadows over the golden cornfields, Dorothy Thornfield called the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department to report her brother as missing. The silence that began at that moment would last 52 years. The initial response from the authorities to Robert Thornfield's disappearance was, to put it politely, inadequate. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Kowalski, who took Dorothy's initial call, noted the basic information but showed no particular urgency. Adult men disappeared temporarily all the time, he explained, especially men with known marital problems. Robert was probably cooling off somewhere. He would turn up in a day or two. "You don't understand," Dorothy insisted, her voice rising an octave with frustration. "My brother is not the type of man who just cools off. He had important commitments. He would never, not once, just not show up." Kowalski promised to send a patrol to check the property. Dorothy hung up the phone, feeling a toxic mix of anger and terror. Sheriff Raymond Tucker arrived personally at Thornfield Farms at 8 at night on October 14th. Tucker was 56 years old, with 32 of them in law enforcement, and the weary posture of a man who had seen too much. But even he had to admit that there were worrying elements in Robert Thornfield's disappearance. The house was intact. There were no signs of struggle or forced entry. Robert's wallet was on the nightstand in his bedroom, containing $420 in cash and all his identification cards. His passport was in a desk drawer in the office. Clothes were organized. Margaret Thornfield was interviewed by phone in Des Moines. Her reaction to her husband's disappearance was complex. Genuine concern mixed with something Tucker identified as residual guilt. She confirmed that the marriage was effectively over, that she was considering formal divorce, but insisted there had never been threats or violence between them, just emptiness. Robert was like living with a very efficient ghost, she said in a monotone voice. He provided everything I needed materially, but emotionally, it was like being married to a calculator. When Tucker asked about enemies, Margaret gave a humorless laugh. "Sheriff, you are asking about a man who built an agricultural empire by systematically destroying smaller family farms around him, who used his political connections to secure exclusive contracts, who never, not once, did anything out of pure kindness. How many enemies do you think he had?" The answer was many. The investigations revealed that Robert had forced at least 17 farming families to sell their properties through a combination of economic pressure, market price manipulation, and what some openly called corporate intimidation. There were also 3 civil lawsuits against him, including one for illegal appropriation of irrigation water from neighboring properties. One name emerged repeatedly during the interviews: Vincent Calabrese. Calabrese was a second-generation farmer whose 200-acre property was adjacent to the south sector of Thornfield Farms. In 1969, after a prolonged legal dispute over water rights, Calabrese had lost his farm to mortgage foreclosure. Persistent rumors suggested that Robert had orchestrated the situation, using his banking connections to ensure Calabrese's loan was called prematurely. Vincent Calabrese was found in an improvised trailer in Riverdale, living with his wife and 3 children in conditions that contrasted cruelly with the opulence of Thornfield Farms. When confronted by Tucker about his whereabouts on October 14th, Calabrese had a solid alibi. He was working at a gas station in Cedar Rapids, with multiple witnesses confirming his presence all day. But Calabrese's eyes gleamed with something dark when Tucker mentioned Robert's disappearance.
"I'm not going to pretend I'm crying," he said. "Thornfield destroyed my family. My children are growing up in poverty because of that man's greed. If something bad happened to him, maybe it's just the universe balancing the books." The search for the Ford Pinto expanded to 3 states. Alerts were issued to Nebraska, Illinois, and Missouri. Law enforcement agencies in all the large and small cities in the region received the vehicle description: 1971 Ford Pinto, orange, Iowa, license, plate number TF4482. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, 0 concrete leads. A witness in Omaha, Nebraska, reported seeing an orange Pinto in a motel parking lot 3 days after the disappearance. When police arrived, the car had left. The motel manager had no useful records. Another witness in Chicago claimed to have seen a man who could be Robert at a train station. The description was too vague to be useful. A fisherman found a partially burned work jacket near the Des Moines River in March 1972. Dorothy identified it as possibly belonging to Robert, but forensic tests were inconclusive. The Millbrook County community was divided in their theories. Some believed that Robert had staged his own disappearance, that he was living under a false identity somewhere far away, enjoying money secretly hidden in offshore accounts. This theory gained traction when people pointed to the Ford Pinto. Why buy a new car if not to establish a new identity? Others insisted that Robert had been murdered, that one of the many enemies he had created had finally acted. Vincent Calabrese remained the favorite suspect in bar conversations, despite his solid alibi. He could have hired someone, conspiracy theorists argued. A darker theory circulated in hushed voices that Margaret had orchestrated something, that she and possibly an unknown lover had bled. Contracts were lost, equipment broke down without being properly replaced, workers left in search of more stable employment. In 1978, 7 years after the disappearance, Robert Thornfield was officially declared dead by the Millbrook County Tort. It was a necessary but deeply unsatisfactory declaration, a bureaucratic conclusion without a body, without explanation, without real closure. Margaret formally inherited the property, but she had no interest or skill to manage it. Jamie, now 18 years old, had even less interest. The sensitive boy had grown into an equally sensitive man, studying literature at the University of Iowa and as far away as possible from the agricultural world that had defined and ultimately consumed his father. Margaret sold portions of the property over the following years, first the 1,200 most distant acres, then the storage silos, eventually almost everything except the main house and the immediately adjacent fields. Approximately 300 acres that she kept more out of melancholic sentimentality than any practical reason. In 1985, Margaret Thornfield died of pancreatic cancer. She was only 50 years old. Dorothy said in later interviews that Margaret never really recovered from Robert's disappearance, not because she loved him, but because the inconclusiveness of everything had left a wound that could never properly heal. Jamie inherited what was left. He never lived on the property. He visited sporadically, mainly to check that the house was not being vandalized. Eventually, he stopped visiting altogether. The main house began to deteriorate. Shutters fell and were not replaced. Paint peeled under the brutal sun of Iowa summers. Windows broke. The century-old elms that Robert had proudly planted died of Dutch elm disease, their gray skeletons remaining as macabre sentinels around the abandoned property. The fields, without maintenance, reverted to wild vegetation. Volunteer corn sprouted randomly, growing disorganized and being choked by weeds. Nature was slowly reclaiming what Robert Thornfield had forced into submission. For decades, the property gained a dark local reputation. Teenagers began spreading stories that it was haunted. Some claimed to have seen lights moving through the empty house at night. Others swore they had heard the sound of a car engine coming from empty areas of the property. In 1998, a group of high school students broke into the abandoned house on a dare. They found Robert's office practically untouched, a time capsule accidentally preserved. Documents were still organized in files. A wall calendar still showed October 1971, open to the page that included October 14th. But it was in a locked desk drawer that they found something that briefly reignited interest in the case. Inside, in an unmarked envelope, there were photographs. They were not family photographs. They were surveillance photographs. Black and white images clearly taken from a distance, showing a man who appeared to be following Robert. The photographs were turned over to the authorities. The sheriff at the time, David Morrison, son of Helen Morrison from the gas station, opened a cold case file. He tried to identify the man in the photographs, but 3 decades had passed. Witnesses were dead or had degraded memories. The investigation led nowhere. The mystery of Robert Thornfield gradually faded, even from local memory. New generations did not know who he was. The property became just that abandoned place on County Road 47, something to point out while driving, but not something anyone thought deeply about. Vincent Calabresi died in 2003 of emphysema. Until the end, he insisted he knew nothing about Robert Thornfield's disappearance. His children had grown up, left Iowa, and rarely returned. The story of their family's lost farm was something they'd preferred to forget. Dorothy Thornfield spent her final years in a nursing home in Cedar Rapids. She passed away in 2019 at 91 years old without ever knowing what had happened to her brother. Among her belongings, nurses found boxes and boxes of newspaper clippings about the case, letters to authorities requesting the investigation be reopened, and personal diaries full of speculations and theories. Jamie Thornfield became a literature professor at a small college in Vermont. He legally changed his name to James Fletcher, adopting his mother's maiden name in 2001. When contacted by investigative journalists over the years, he politely but firmly refused to comment. "That chapter of my life is closed," he wrote in an email to a reporter in 2015. "I prefer to keep it that way." The Thornfield Farms property changed hands several times through back tax sales and mortgage foreclosures. Eventually, in 2020, it was bought by a Des Moines real estate development company called Heartland Properties, LLC. Their plans were simple: demolish everything, level the land, and build a suburban residential complex called Meadowbrook Estates. Ironic, considering there was neither meadow nor brook on the property. And it was during the initial phase of that development that the land finally revealed its darkest secret. The morning of October 17, 2023, began like any other construction workday. The Heartland Properties earth-moving team had started the process of leveling the ground for the foundations of the new houses. The site supervisor, Marcus Washington, was operating a Cat 336 excavator, removing layers of compacted soil from an area about 400 meters south of the old main house. It was 10:23 in the morning. Marcus remembers the exact time because he had just checked his cell phone moments before restarting the equipment after a quick break. The autumn sun was strong. Exactly 52 years and 3 days after Robert Thornfield's disappearance, the excavator's bucket penetrated the earth at approximately 3 meters and 80 centimeters deep when Marcus felt unusual resistance. The sound changed, that characteristic screech of metal against metal that any experienced operator recognizes immediately. "I first thought it was an old pipe or maybe a forgotten septic tank," Marcus said later to investigators. "Old rural properties have all kinds of things buried. But when I cleared more dirt and saw the color, that faded but still recognizable orange, my blood froze." Marcus shut off the excavator and climbed down. Other team members, including Brian Foster and Daniel Ortega, approached. Together, using manual shovels and extreme care, they began to expose what was buried. It was a car, completely buried, not partially covered by a landslide or casual abandonment, deliberately buried in a deep trench that had been dug specifically for that purpose and then carefully filled. The vehicle was in surreal preservation condition considering 5 decades under the ground. The metal structure had rusted significantly, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a compact, small car with that characteristic 70s bodyline, and the color, despite the time and soil, was still visibly orange. Brian Foster, who was 58 years old and had grown up in Millbrook County, felt immediate and terrifying recognition. My mother used to tell stories about the magnate who disappeared when she was young, and she always mentioned the orange car that was never found. Marcus Washington called his supervisor at Heartland Properties. The supervisor called the corporate office, and someone there, showing rare good sense, immediately called the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Tyler Bennett arrived at the site at 11:15 in the morning. Bennett was 36 years old, had been elected just 2 years earlier, and had never dealt with anything remotely like this. But he had grown up hearing stories about the Thornfield case. Everyone in Millbrook County had. Bennett established an immediate crime scene perimeter. He called the Iowa State Patrol. He contacted the state forensic office, and then, with hands that trembled slightly, he began to photographically document what was emerging from the earth. As more soil was carefully removed, the magnitude of the discovery became clear. The Ford Pinto was in a trench that had, of the mortal remains, took 3 full days, not because of technical difficulty, but because of the extreme care needed to preserve any possible evidence. Every bone fragment was documented, photographed in situ, and catalogued before removal. The body was in a seated position, or rather what remained of it was in a configuration that suggested the person had died seated in the driver's seat. The skeleton's hands were positioned as if they had been on the steering wheel. The head was tilted forward, as if looking down. Fragments of clothing survived, cotton fibers consistent with a work shirt, pieces of leather that were probably from a belt, metal buttons on jeans pants. A Rolex wristwatch was still attached to the bones of the left wrist, its face frozen at 8:47, likely the time it finally stopped working under the earth. But it was one specific item that definitively confirmed the identity. Attached to the rusted belt was a silver keychain engraved. The engraving, still partially legible despite the corrosion, read RTF, Thornfield Farms, 1965. Robert James Thornfield had been found. 52 years after his disappearance, the corn magnate was coming home in a bag body and boxes of forensic evidence. The forensic analysis of Robert Thornfield's mortal remains and the Ford Pinto took 8 months to complete. Dr. Chen and her team worked with a meticulousness that reflected both the scientific complexity and the historical magnitude of the case. The results were simultaneously clarifying and deeply disconcerting. Identity confirmation was established by multiple methods. Dental analysis, compared with Robert's 1970 dental records, was a definitive match. DNA extracted from a femur was compared with DNA from James Fletcher, who, despite his initial reluctance, agreed to provide a sample when contacted by authorities. It was his father, no doubt. The cause of death was determined as massive cranial trauma. Dr. Chen explained in her June 2024 press conference. The force necessary to create this fracture pattern would be substantial. We are talking about trauma that would have resulted in nearly instantaneous death or immediate unconsciousness, followed by death within minutes. But here is where things get complicated. The position of the body and the vehicle suggested something extraordinarily specific. Robert Thornfield was seated in the driver's seat when he received the fatal blow. But the nature and location of the fracture indicated that the impact came from an angle that would be extremely difficult to achieve if Robert were simply seated inside a closed car. The physics does not make much sense, admitted Chief Investigator Marcus Reynolds of the Iowa DCI. To create this trauma pattern in the specific location we see, the attacker would have to be positioned outside the vehicle, probably on the right side, swinging something like a baseball bat or iron bar through an open window. But all the car's windows were closed when we found it. This raised disturbing possibilities. Either the window had been open at the moment of the attack and then closed before burial, or something even more sinister had occurred. Additional vehicle analysis revealed more anomalies. The key was still in the ignition, turned to the off position. The gas tank was approximately 1/4 full, consistent with a vehicle that had driven about 50 to 70 kilometers since the last refueling. The odometer showed only 143 kilometers. This Pinto had barely been used. Even more intriguing, there were no signs of struggle inside the vehicle, no defensive scratches on the interior panels, no damage consistent with an attempt to escape or resist. If Robert had been attacked while in the car, he apparently had no time or ability to react. Examination of the soil around and inside the vehicle revealed something that made investigators pause. Mixed with the natural soil, there was earth of a different composition, soil that geological analysis determined to be from a completely different area of the property, probably from the northeast sector of Thornfield Farms, more than 1.5 kilometers away. Why would someone bring soil from another part of the property to bury a body? The most plausible answer was disturbing: to accelerate the decomposition process and confuse future forensic analyses. Soil from multiple sources with different bacterial and chemical compositions would make any dating or soil analysis extremely complicated. This suggested planning, premeditation, sophisticated knowledge. The trench itself revealed more secrets. Analysis of the excavation wall showed equipment marks consistent with a John Deere backhoe, exactly the type of equipment Thornfield Farms owned in 1971. Property records miraculously preserved in a state tax archive confirmed that the farm had 3 John Deere backhoes that year. But here is the crucial detail. Operating a backhoe and digging a 4-meter-deep trench is not something you do quickly or easily. It requires several hours, technical knowledge, and access to the equipment. It also makes considerable noise and is visually conspicuous. Whoever buried Robert Thornfield had time, access, and knowledge. The criminal investigation turned to examining all the people who were at Thornfield Farms on October 14, 1971, and in the following days. Thomas Hendrickson, the foreman, had passed away in 2015, but his children provided his personal diaries, decades of meticulous notes on daily farm operations. The entries for October 1971 were fascinating. October 14th. Mr. T left in the morning, oversee NE sector harvest as instructed. He seemed different, worried. October 15th, Mr. T did not return. Dorothy looking for him. Police came. October 16th to 20th, entries focused on farm operations, mentioning growing concern and police interference. October 21st, extra work in the south sector. Today, soil very churned near the old fields, maybe preparation for spring planting. That last entry made investigators sit up straight. Soil very churned near where the body was found, just 1 week after the disappearance. The DCI team began searching for equipment records. Who had used the Thornfield Farms backhoes in the relevant period? But such specific records simply did not exist from 1971. Equipment was tracked only vaguely for maintenance purposes, not daily use. Investigators interviewed all the farm workers still alive from 1971. Most had weak memories of specific events half a century ago, but 2 remembered something relevant. Robert had cheated Hendrickson out of a series of agricultural methods Hendrickson had developed on Thornfield Farms. Robert had encouraged Hendrickson to implement these techniques on Thornfield Farms, promising future partnership or profit sharing. Instead, Robert had patented the techniques in his own name, licensed them to other agricultural operations, and pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars that morally, if not legally, belonged to Hendrickson. When Hendrickson discovered this in September 1971, there was a documented confrontation. Neighbors remembered shouts coming from Robert's office. Hendrickson had threatened lawsuit. Robert had laughed, apparently confident that his legal connections would protect him. 3 weeks later, Robert Thornfield was dead. But even with clear motive and reasonable opportunity, the investigation hit a frustrating wall. Thomas Hendrickson was dead. He could not be questioned, charged, or tried. And the physical evidence, though suggestive, was not definitive enough for absolute conclusion. Dr. Chen summed up the situation perfectly during the press conference. We know how Robert Thornfield died. We know when, approximately. We know where, but the definitive who and why remain technically unproven beyond a reasonable doubt. In March 2025, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation officially closed the case of the homicide of Robert James Thornfield. Their conclusion? Thomas Hendrickson is the primary person of interest, death by cranial trauma, motive established, but no doubt, but also one that tells a story about ambition, betrayal, and the consequences of treating human beings as obstacles to be removed. Dorothy Thornfield never knew that her brother had been found. She had died 4 years before the priest's discovery. But her diaries, preserved by her family, revealed that on some deep level she always knew that Robert had not simply disappeared. Bob was not a man to run, she wrote in 1989. If he is gone, it is because someone made him gone. And if someone made him gone, then he is under our land somewhere. The land always keeps secrets, but land also eventually tells those secrets. She was right. There are questions that will probably never be answered. How exactly was Robert lured or forced to that specific location? Was the Pinto's window really open at the moment of the fatal blow? Or did the attack occur outside the vehicle and the body was placed inside afterward? Did Hendrickson act alone or have help? And more disturbingly, how many other people knew what had happened and chose silence? 46 people worked at Thornfield Farms in October 1971. It is statistically unlikely that only one person noticed the hours necessary to dig a 4-meter trench, position a vehicle, and fill it completely. Someone saw something. Someone knew something. But in the rural Midwest of the 1970s, loyalty to a foreman who treated workers with decency was probably stronger than loyalty to a boss who treated everyone as resources to be exploited. If there was a conspiracy of silence at Thornfield Farms after October 14, 1971, it was one that held perfectly for 52 years. Every person who potentially knew something took that knowledge to the grave, except the land. The land kept its secrets, but only until someone asked the right questions at the right depth. Today, if you drive along County Road 47 in Millbrook County, Iowa, you will see cornfields stretching to the horizon. In autumn, when the ears are ripe and golden, moving in waves under the constant wind of the plains, it is possible to momentarily forget the dark history that land holds. But there is a marker now, simple, discreet, installed by the Millbrook County Historical Society. It does not glorify Robert Thornfield, nor demonize his possible killers. It simply states facts. At this site in October 2023, the mortal remains of Robert James Thornfield, 1928 to 1971, owner of Thornfield Farms, were discovered. His disappearance on October 14, 1971, remained an unsolved mystery for 52 years. May his discovery serve as a reminder that the deed hid in land eventually reveals all truth. It is a fitting epitaph for a man who obsessively controlled land, only to be finally betrayed by it. The case of Robert Thornfield forces uncomfortable questions about justice, morality, and consequences. If Thomas Hendrickson did indeed kill Robert Thornfield, it was clear murder, illegal, wrong, condemnable. But it was in response to years of systematic exploitation, intellectual theft, and calculated cruelty. Does that make the act justifiable? Not in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of workers who witnessed Robert destroy lives for decades, who saw Hendrickson robbed and humiliated, perhaps
Property. There, for reasons we can only infer, he met someone, probably Thomas Hendrickson. Words were exchanged, perhaps threats, perhaps ultimatums, and then, in a moment of explosive violence or cold determination, a blow was struck. A blow that ended the life of one of the richest men in Millbrook County. A blow that resolved nothing and created 5 decades of mystery. The Ford Pinto became a tomb. The 4-meter trench became an unmarked grave. And the Iowa land, silent and patient as ever, kept its secret until it did not. If there is a lesson in the case of Robert Thornfield, perhaps it is this. You can control land, manipulate people, build empires through relentless ambition, but eventually, inevitably, the land reclaims everything, and when it does, it reveals exactly what you truly were. Robert Thornfield was formally buried in April 2025 in a small private ceremony attended only by James Fletcher and a few distant cousins. His grave is in Oakwood Cemetery in Cedar Rapids, a simple headstone that lists only name and dates. No elaborate epitaph, no grand statements about accomplishments, just silence. The same silence that began 54 years ago on a foggy October morning when an orange Ford Pinto disappeared into golden cornfields, taking with it a man, a secret, and decades of unanswered questions. The land finally spoke, but it whispered, not shouted, and the words it offered were fragmented, incomplete, frustrating in their ambiguity. Some mysteries are not meant to be fully resolved. They are meant to remind that there is always more beneath the surface, always more depth to explore, always more truths waiting to be uncovered. If you drive through Millbrook County, Iowa, listen carefully when the wind crosses the cornfields. Some say they can still hear the echo of a Ford Pinto engine driving to nowhere, pursued by ghosts that never truly rest. The land tells its secrets eventually, but it never tells all of